Hi, today we'll be talking about the history of bilingual education and how there's been reforms in the United States to better help students who are English language learners and also bilingual students to be more successful in their education. And my name is Ashley Witt. So what is bilingual education? So often in the United States, there is said that we have a native language, and that is said to be English, and this is not true. The United States does not have a national language or a native language. We have a variety of languages in the States, and English happens to be one that a lot of people speak, but there are a lot of other different languages in the United States that can have a big impact in a certain area, or that a variety of people speak. So what does bilingual mean? It means when you speak two languages fluently. And in the United States, like I said before, more than one language is spoken. And due to this, you could say that the United States is a bilingual speaking country. And because of that, schools are required to incorporate bilingual education policies and laws into their schools. And this is beneficial because it helps every student, no matter their language, which will hopefully help them in the future. There's language minority students, which are students that don't typically speak the language in an area that is the native language of the area. So with students like that, bilingual education would help because it would help them kind of get more immersed into the language of the area, but also still learn within their language so that they're able to still learn proficiently. And there are laws in place for bilingual education, like I said before, and we're going to talk about that today and why they've been created and how they've changed over the years. So the first one we're going to talk about is Brown versus Board of Education, 1964. And so this is a pretty famous court case, and it happened right before the Civil Rights Act. And it was also during the time period of the Civil Rights Act's movement. And prior to this case, schools were segregated based on race, and this case made it illegal for segregation to happen in school systems, and segregation is, like I said, when they were segregating them based on their race, so splitting them up. And this had a big impact on creating the Civil Rights Act and kind of making things more equal for everyone. And it was also important because, like I said, it pushed for the Civil Rights Act, which paved the way to many other bilingual education acts to be created. And also, by desegregating the classrooms, the public and the government were able to kind of see where bilingual students were and how they fit into the English-dominant school settings. And by the community being able to see how they were being impacted, more laws and court cases and things like that were able to happen to better their future. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this was a law that banned discrimination against sex, race, national origin in any public places. And it was created right during the Civil Rights Movement time. Since it banned public discrimination in public places, this also went with schools because there were many public schools, or there still are many public schools, and so it was forcing them to not discriminate either. And one way to discriminate is not giving fair education to everyone. And so this is why this act was so important, because it was the starting point that led to so many other laws to be created to make education even better and make even other stuff better. But right now specifically, it made bilingual education, it opened the doors for it. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, it was created by Lyndon B. Johnson, who also at the time was going through a poverty war. And with this poverty war, so this act wanted to help low-income students, who typically were students who weren't white and who spoke a different language, and help them do better in school. So this act provided funds to school and created new policies so that hopefully these low-income students could start to do better in school. And again, this was aimed at low-income students, but a lot of the low-income students were bilingual students and students who were a different race than white. And so this was kind of a building block to the next law we're going to talk about. So the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, this was the first act to specifically help bilingual students in their education and specifically aimed for their success. It was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson again, and it was promoting, a lot of people question, was it promoting learning English or supporting bilingualism? So it was again aimed at disadvantaged students in public school systems, and many of the students who were disadvantaged were students who were poor and could not understand this language. And it was implemented by giving extra funds to school, training teachers, giving resources to the students in the school systems. However, this law did not require for the school or teachers to teach a different language. It just gave more resources to help try to immerse them to better understand their education. The Lau Remedies in 1974, these took place in California, and was for Chinese students who spoke Chinese, who didn't know a lot of English but were being put in general education classes and not being helped and kind of just being left there to swim or sink. In 1974, a court case called Law versus Nicholas was held, and it was because the community, such as parents and other people, were not happy that their English language learners / bilingual not receiving the education that they deserve just because they spoke another language. And so this created the Lau Remedies. And the Lau Remedies basically make sure that schools are doing what they're supposed to be and following the bilingual policies and implementing what they should be in their school systems. No Child Left Behind, 2002. So this was under President George W. Bush, and it was reauthorized from the ESEA Act. And they had a few reforms that changed and focused more on other factors. And one way that changed is that they didn't use the word bilingualism anymore. They used limited English proficiency. And what that means is that these are students who need help with reading and writing in English and don't know how to do that a lot with just by themselves. And this act put a lot of emphasis on test taking, such as standardized testing. And in Texas, when this act came out, for example, there was the tax test, and there was a very strong emphasis on that tax test. And bilingual students were also required to take this same test, even if they weren't proficient. And there was an exception for bilingual students. Their reading scores at first were not counted in the school scores, and later on, in 2006, the math scores wouldn't be counted either. And then to be continued. So schools each year had to meet annually a percentage of students that pass their tests for the school to continue to receive funding and be in good standing. And English language learners were not a part of this score. They took a test also called the English language proficiency test to see where they were at. And then schools were required to basically have these scores keep improving each year. Many teachers didn't like this law because they felt like they were just teaching to the test, and this is a very popular saying. Even then and then even now, so many teachers say we're teaching to the test. And that's one big struggle with this act. It lasted for 14 years, and it kind of brought bilingual education down a little bit because, again, teachers were just teaching the test and worried about not getting in trouble, and so this act was so emphasized on test taking that it was actually leaving children behind. Race to the Top 2009. So this was a grant implemented by the government in 2009, and it was a college-ready program to help public schools get their students ready for college. And if you did this, you'd receive a very large grant for your school. Over half the states received this, and everyone had it in the school had to be incorporated to the college-ready prep, including bilingual students and students with disabilities. And even though there was the idea to get them ready for college, there was still such an emphasis on test taking. And this kind of brought light that, yes, it's good for college to get college ready, but bilingual students were still struggling in public education, and what they needed weren't being met because there was an emphasis on test taking. And then Every Student Succeeds Act 2015. So this act replaced No Child Left Behind, and it required many of the same things that No Child Left Behind had. So it still had an emphasis on test taking, and around this time in Texas, tax test went from STAR test, and this, so there was still standardized testing going on. It had more flexibility, which was good. It gave schools more of a flexible way of showing that they were being accountable and getting their students where they needed to be. So, and they also had better expectations / more realistic ones for bilingual students. So this was a better one for bilingual students because there was more options for student success instead of just forcing test taking on students who weren't proficient in the language. And then Proposition 58, 2016. So this was a proposition in California in November 2016. Originally it was called Proposition 227. However, many people in the community didn't like this proposition because they felt like bilingual education wasn't being addressed in the best way. So Senator Ricardo Lara created Senate Bill 1174 to get rid of this previous proposition, and it passed. And so this new proposition, it basically told schools that they have to help their students become English proficient, and it required schools to implement immersion programs to help students who are learning English and bilingual students get more immersed in the language that's around them. It's also important because it gave parents more of a right in their children's education, and the ones that and how their students received their education. And this was specifically in California, so it was a big law in California, but not all states have exactly the same law. And then lastly, the Look Act 2017. So this was a law that was created that gives choice to states on how to implement bilingual education. So there's either bilingual education or language acquisition programs. Some schools implement it by bilingual education, professional organizations, or having few schools in a district or state have bilingual education programs. For example, like the last one, my brother, when he was in elementary, he was in a bilingual program specifically at his school in our city, and he received half his day in English, half in Spanish. He's a native English speaker. And then he also had students who were native Spanish speakers in his class who they were learning together, half English, half Spanish. And so that's what some school districts do. And all these reforms acts and laws have had a really big impact on bilingual education, and you're able to see how far it has come, and from brown bursts of education where they were just being thrown into classrooms, and then now where there's actually programs and organizations and way for them to get immersed in the language